A storm had been predicted by the weather forecasters, but the sky outside was clear, almost too clear. The sun shone down on the city's most prestigious school, but inside its walls, a different kind of storm was brewing. Miss Thelma sat at her desk, her sharp eyes scanning the students walking past her classroom. She was known to be the strictest teacher in the school, cold, distant, and merciless. To her, rules were sacred, and discipline was everything. She had no patience for students who lacked order. And there was one student she could not stand more than any other, Ida. Ida was different from the others. She didn't giggle in the hallways or gossip in the cafeteria. She barely had any friends and kept to herself, moving like a shadow through the school. There was something about her that irritated Miss Thelma deeply. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, her back always straight, her eyes too calm, too deep, as if she were listening to something no one else could hear. Or maybe it was the way she never cried, no matter how many times Miss Thelma punished her. She had seen pride before in students, the wealthy kids who believed they were untouchable. But Ida, she wasn't like them. She didn't boast about her riches, didn't show off expensive gadgets or flaunt designer bags. And yet, there was something about her that made Miss Thelma certain, this girl is hiding something. And that made her furious. Ida never spoke of the punishments. Not to her classmates, not to her teachers, and certainly not to her parents. She simply endured them. The extra assignments. The standing outside the classroom for hours. The countless strokes of the cane on her palms for the smallest mistakes. She bore them all without complaint. But deep inside something simmered. Quiet storm. A secret waiting to break free. She felt it most during the nights, when she lay awake staring at her ceiling, hearing the faint sound of waves crashing, though her house was miles from the ocean. She felt it in her skin whenever she stood under the sun for too long, the way it tingled like a memory she couldn't quite grasp. She felt it in her bones whenever it rained, the strange comfort it brought, like a lullaby whispered by a voice she didn't know but somehow recognized. And she felt it now, as she walked into the classroom, the hairs on her arms rising as she caught Miss Thelma's sharp gaze. Miss Thelma watched Ida take her seat at the back of the class, her face unreadable as always. She tightened her grip on her cane. Look at her, she thought bitterly. Not a care in the world. No fear, no respect. Miss Thelma had dealt with many students before, but none had tested her patience like Ida. The girl never talked back, never argued, never broke any rules outright. But it was her silence that made Miss Thelma feel like she was losing control. She had expected Ida to cry by now, to break, but she never did. And that only made Miss Thelma more determined to bend her. That day, during the lunch break, Miss Thelma noticed something strange. As she walked past the cafeteria, she saw Ida sitting alone at a table, her food untouched. That was not unusual. Ida was always alone. What was unusual was what happened next. A boy walked past Aida's table, carrying a glass of water. He tripped, and the glass tumbled out of his hands, spilling all over Aida's lap. Ida gasped and jumped up. But instead of soaking into her uniform, the water rolled off her skirt like drops of oil. Not a single spot remained wet. The boy looked confused. That's weird. Ida quickly grabbed her tray and hurried out of the cafeteria. Miss Thelma narrowed her eyes. Something was wrong with that girl. Over the next few days, Miss Thelma began to watch Ida even more closely. She noticed things she hadn't paid attention to before. How Ida never drank water in school. How she always kept a distance from swimming pools during sports days. How sometimes when the sun hit her skin just right, there was a faint shimmer, like tiny scales glistening before disappearing again. And then there was the rain. Whenever it rained, Ida seemed different. Her posture became relaxed. Her usually guarded eyes softened, almost like she could hear a melody no one else could. Miss Thelma told herself it was nonsense. But deep down she felt it. Something was off about Ida. And she was going to get to the bottom of it. For Ida, the punishments continued as always. She barely flinched when Miss Thelma made her stand outside the classroom for hours. She didn't complain when she was given extra homework for no reason. But something inside her was shifting. The nights were getting harder. She dreamed of the ocean, deep, endless, calling to her. She dreamed of a voice, soft, loving, warning her. And then she dreamed of the storm. A storm unlike anything she had ever seen. She woke up one night, her hands trembling. Outside the sky was clear, but she could hear it. The ocean, calling her name. On the day everything changed, the sky was clear in the morning. But there was something in the air, an energy that made the hairs on Aida's arms rise. It wasn't just her. Even the students felt it. They whispered about the heavy feeling in the air, the distant rumble of thunder though there wasn't a cloud in sight. Miss Thelma ignored it. She had been waiting for a reason to punish Ida properly, to finally break her. And today she would get her chance. Because after the break period when she stepped into the class, Ida was not in her seat. She was late. Miss Thelma smiled coldly and picked up her cane. Finally, she thought. The storm was about to begin. The moment Ida stepped into the classroom, she knew something was wrong. The air felt heavier than usual, thick like the sky before a storm. The eyes of her classmates were wide with anticipation, and the silence in the room was unnatural. And then she saw her. Miss Thelma stood at the front of the class, her cane in hand, her lips pressed into a thin, cruel smile. "You're late," she said, her voice sharp as glass. Ida swallowed. Before she could explain, before she could even breathe, Miss Thelma lifted her cane and brought it down with a loud crack against the wooden desk. The class flinched. "I don't want to hear your excuses," Miss Thelma hissed. "Come forward." Ida hesitated. Her heart pounded in her chest, but not from fear. No, it was something else, something deeper. A warning, like the way the waves recede before a great storm crashes onto the shore. Slowly she stepped forward. Miss Thelma's grip on the cane tightened. "You think you're special, don't you?" she whispered, low enough that only Ida could hear. Ida didn't answer. She knew by now that nothing she said would change Miss Thelma's mind. "Put out your hands." Ida obeyed. The first stroke landed, sharp and stinging. Ida didn't flinch. The second, third. By the fifth, the classroom was deathly silent. No one dared to move. Miss Thelma was furious. Aida's hand should have been trembling by now. Her eyes filled with tears. But they weren't. She just stood there, still, quiet, almost too calm. Miss Thelma's anger burned hotter. 12 strokes, she declared, her voice ringing through the room. The class gasped. Everyone knew that 12 strokes of the cane was a punishment reserved for the worst offenses. For students who fought, cheated, or disrespected a teacher. And all Ida had done was be late. But no one dared to speak up. One by one the strokes landed. By the 12th, Miss Thelma was panting slightly. Her hand ached from gripping the cane so tightly. But Ida, she hadn't made a single sound. Miss Thelma's fury turned cold. "Kneel in front of the class," she ordered, pointing to the space before the chalkboard. Ida obeyed. "Raise your hands," Miss Thelma added. "And stay there until the end of the day." The entire class held their breath. That was 5 more hours. Ida knelt, her arms raised. Her long hair cascaded over her shoulders, and her skin, which had always seemed too smooth, too perfect, gleamed faintly under the classroom lights. The room was silent except for the ticking of the clock. 1 minute, 5 minutes, an hour. Then it happened. First no one noticed. Aida's breathing had changed. It was slow, too slow, like the rolling tide before a storm. Then the first gasp came. Someone pointed. "Her legs," a boy whispered, his voice shaky. Miss Thelma turned. Her breath caught in her throat. Aida's legs were changing. It started at her ankles, thin, shimmering scales emerging from her skin, shifting and gleaming under the classroom lights. The change spread upward, consuming her calves, her knees. By the time it reached her thighs, the whispering had turned into panicked cries. "Ida!" a girl squeaked, eyes wide with terror. Ida looked down. Her breath hitched. "No, not now." She clenched her jaw, squeezing her eyes shut as if that could stop it. But it was too late. The transformation was happening. Chaos broke loose. Students pushed back their chairs, scrambling away from Ida. Someone knocked over a textbook. Another screamed. Miss Thelma stumbled backward, her cane falling to the floor. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing panic. The once pristine classroom was now a scene of hysteria. But Ida, she wasn't scared. She was angry. Her nails dug into her palms as she tried to will the transformation away. But her body was reacting on its own. It knew what she was. And worse, so did the sea. A sound filled the room. Low, haunting. The rumble of distant thunder. Aida's eyes darted to the window. The once clear sky had darkened. Thick, heavy clouds rolled in at an unnatural speed. The wind howled through the trees outside. And then, boom, a clap of thunder roared, shaking the very foundation of the school. Then came the rain. Heavy, furious, like the heavens had been waiting for this moment. Aida's breath was ragged now. She didn't mean for this to happen. She had fought against it for so long. But she was tired. Tired of hiding. Tired of pretending to be something she wasn't. She turned to Miss Thelma, who stood frozen, her eyes filled with disbelief and something else, fear. "The ocean never forgets," Ida whispered, her voice barely above the sound of the rain hammering against the windows. Miss Thelma's lips parted as if she wanted to speak, but no words came out. She knew. She knew she had punished the wrong person. The rain grew heavier. Ida felt something shift in the air, deep, ancient, powerful. The sea had come for its own. And Miss Thelma would not escape the consequences of what she had done. The rain crashed against the windows like an angry beast trying to break through. The sky had turned a deep, menacing shade of gray, and the wind howled through the city like a warning no one could ignore. Inside the classroom, chaos reigned. Students huddled against the walls, their faces pale with fear. Some whispered prayers, others stared at Ida with wide, terrified eyes. Miss Thelma. She was frozen. Her cane lay forgotten on the floor. Her hands trembled as she took a step back, her mind racing to make sense of what she was seeing. Ida knelt in the center of the room, her hands still raised in punishment, but she was no longer just a girl. Her legs shimmered with iridescent scales, shifting colors like the sea at sunset. The transformation was nearly complete. And outside the storm raged. Miss Thelma had always prided herself on being in control. She controlled her students. She controlled her classroom. She controlled the way things were supposed to be. But now, nothing was in her control. She had heard stories before, old whispers of beings that lived beneath the ocean's waves, creatures that were more than human. But they were just myths, weren't they? Her breath came in short, panicked bursts. "Ida," she croaked, stepping forward. But the moment she did, the thunder boomed so loudly that the entire classroom shook. The lights flickered. A gust of wind slammed the windows open, sending papers flying across the room. Miss Thelma stumbled back. Ida lifted her head, and for the first time, something flickered in her deep, dark eyes. Something ancient, something powerful, something not of this world. "You shouldn't have done this," Ida whispered. The room fell deathly silent. A shiver ran down Miss Thelma's spine. It wasn't just their classroom anymore. All of Rosewood High was caught in the storm's grip. Teachers ran through the hallways, struggling to keep doors and windows shut. Rain seeped in through the cracks, drenching the marble floors. Students screamed as the wind howled like a living thing, tearing through the school grounds with unnatural force. And at the center of it all, in a single classroom, knelt a girl who wasn't just a girl. Ida could feel it now, the pull. It was strong, stronger than it had ever been. The ocean was calling her back. And it was angry. Ida had spent her whole life pretending to be something she wasn't. Her mother had warned her. Never reveal what you are. Never let them know. But how could she hide forever? She had always been different. She had always felt the water in her bones, heard the whispers of the waves in her dreams. And now she could hear her mother's voice, urgent, commanding, loving. "Ida, my child, you must return. My child, the ocean remembers. My child, the sea will not forgive. Ida closed her eyes, breathing in the storm. She had fought it for so long. But she couldn't fight it anymore. Miss Thelma felt something shift in the air. She didn't know how, but she could feel it, something beyond her understanding. Then suddenly the rain stopped. The wind died. Everything became still. Too still. The eerie silence sent a chill through everyone in the room. And then, from outside the school, a deep voice rumbled through the city, shaking the very ground beneath them. You have harmed what belongs to the sea. And the sea does not forget. Miss Thelma's breath hitched. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. And yet, the voice echoed through the walls, through the streets, through the air itself, heavy and ancient like something that had existed since the beginning of time. The students gasped. Some fell to their knees, whispering prayers. Miss Thelma took a trembling step back. What is happening?" she whispered. Ida opened her eyes. Her gaze locked onto Miss Thelma's. The room grew colder. "Do you understand now?" Ida whispered. Miss Thelma's lips parted, but no words came. She was looking into the eyes of something that was no longer just human. Ida knew she couldn't stay here anymore. She could feel it, the waves crashing inside her, the call of the tide growing stronger. She wasn't meant for this place. And the ocean, it wanted her back. But before she left, there was one last thing to do. She turned to Miss Thelma, her voice calm, yet carrying the weight of something vast, something eternal. "The ocean doesn't forget, Miss Thelma," she said softly. Her words sent shivers through the room. The rain had stopped. The storm had passed. But Miss Thelma knew. This wasn't over. The silence that followed the storm was heavier than the rain that had fallen. Miss Thelma stood frozen, her heart pounding against her ribcage. That voice, still echoed in her mind. It had spoken not just to the school, but to her. "You have harmed what belongs to the sea. And the sea does not forget." The air in the classroom felt thick, like she was standing at the bottom of the ocean, unable to breathe. Ida, the girl she had punished, the girl she had tormented, was no longer just a girl. She was something older, something more. And she was watching Miss Thelma with those impossibly deep eyes. Far away, beyond the city, beyond the rivers and roads, the ocean churned. And beneath its waves, a woman stood at the edge of an underwater palace, her golden eyes fixed on the storm that had just passed. She had felt it the moment it began. Her daughter's pain, her daughter's anger. And now the ocean had spoken. The humans had done what they swore they would never do. They had harmed the blood of the sea. Aida's mother, the queen of the tides, let out a slow breath. She had given her daughter the chance to live among humans. She had warned her to never let them see what she was. But she had always known this day would come. And now there was a debt to be paid. There were old stories. Whispers passed down from generation to generation. Stories of the ocean's anger, of its unforgiving memory. Once long ago, a village had taken something that did not belong to them. A mermaid's child. The ocean had given them a single warning. "Return what is mine, and I will let you live." But they had refused. And the next day, the village was gone. No one knew where it had gone. Only the endless sea remained, its waves lapping against the shore, as if the village had never existed at all. Miss Thelma had never believed in such stories. Till now. Her knees felt weak. The weight of her mistake pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She had always thought she was doing the right thing, teaching discipline, shaping students into perfect, obedient beings. But now she realized, she had crossed a line. Ida had never disrespected her. Ida had never fought back. Ida had never even spoken against her punishments. And yet, Miss Thelma had made it her mission to break her. And for what? Because she had been different. Because she had carried herself with quiet strength instead of fear. Miss Thelma wanted to apologize. She wanted to take back every punishment, every cane stroke, every cruel word. But it was too late. The ocean had already spoken. The news of what had happened in Rosewood High spread quickly. By nightfall, The elders of the city gathered. They had felt the storm. They had heard the voice. And they knew exactly what it meant. "The ocean remembers," one elder murmured. "We have broken our promise," another whispered. There had been a time long ago, when the people of the city had made a vow to the sea. They would never harm the children of the tide. And in return, the ocean would bless them with wealth, with beauty, with power. The city had flourished under that promise. But now they had broken it, and they would pay the price. As the city trembled with fear, Ida stood at the edge of the ocean, her bare feet sinking into the wet sand. She could feel it in her bones. The choice she had to make. The ocean was calling her home. But if she left, the city would suffer. The rain would never stop. The rivers would overflow. The streets would sink beneath the waves. She didn't want revenge. But the sea did. Ida took a deep breath. And then she spoke. Not to the sky, not to the humans, but to the ocean itself. "I will return," she whispered. "But not like this." The waves pulled back, listening. "I will come willingly," she said. "But you must let them go." The wind stilled. The water lapped at her feet, as if thinking. And then, slowly, the waves began to calm. The city would be spared. For now. But Miss Thelma. She would not escape so easily. The ocean never forgets. And neither did Ida. The ocean was calm, but the city was not. Word had spread, of the storm, of the voice, of the girl who was not just a girl. The people whispered in fear, their eyes drifting toward the sea, as if expecting it to rise and claim them at any moment. The elders held urgent meetings, trying to undo the mistakes of their past. But there was one person who feared the ocean's wrath more than anyone. Miss Thelma. She hadn't stepped outside since that day. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the voice again, felt the weight of her mistakes crashing over her like waves against the shore. She had wronged someone who was never meant to be harmed. That evening, as the sky darkened, a knock sounded at Miss Thelma's door. She hesitated before opening it. Ida stood there. She was dressed in simple clothes, her long hair damp from the mist rolling in from the sea. But there was something in her eyes, something powerful, something not human. Miss Thelma swallowed. "Ida. I came to see you," Ida said, her voice quiet but strong. Miss Thelma took a shaky step back. I didn't mean." Ida raised a hand. "I know." And she did. She had seen it in Miss Thelma's eyes that day. The realization, the regret, the fear. But regret did not erase consequences. "I spoke to the sea," Ida continued. Miss Thelma's breath caught. Ida's dark eyes held her still. "I asked it to spare the city." Miss Thelma's knees nearly buckled. You did." Ida nodded. It agreed. A shaky sigh left Miss Thelma's lips. Relief flooded her body. But then Ida took a step forward. "I never asked it to spare you." The wind outside howled. The candlelight flickered. Miss Thelma's mouth went dry. What does that mean?" she whispered. Ida tilted her head. "You punished me," she said softly, "for nothing." Miss Thelma opened her mouth. But Ida wasn't finished. "You humiliated me. You hurt me. You made me feel like I was less than human." The wind outside roared. Miss Thelma's hands trembled. "I didn't." Ida's voice was calm. "But I was never human, was I?" A single tear slipped down Miss Thelma's cheek. She knew what was coming. Outside, the mist thickened, rolling in like the tide. Ida took another step forward, and Miss Thelma took one back. "Please," Miss Thelma whispered. I don't want to." But the sea had already decided. A drop of water dripped from the ceiling. Then another. Miss Thelma's breath came in short gasps as she looked up. Water seeped from the walls, from the floors, from the windows. Slow, steady, unstoppable. It was inside her house. Inside her. Miss Thelma fell to her knees. "Please." Ida watched, her face unreadable. "I didn't want this," Ida said. But the ocean did. And then the water rose. Miss Thelma screamed as the tide swallowed her whole. Her body disappeared beneath the waves that only she could see. her cries muffled, fading, until there was nothing left but silence. The house was dry, the walls unmarked, but Miss Thelma was gone, and she would never be seen again. Ida stood at the edge of the shore, her bare feet sinking into the sand. The sea was waiting. She had always known this day would come. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. The water curled around her ankles like an old friend. She took another step, then another. By the time she reached her waist, the scales had already returned. Her legs fused into a shimmering tail, her skin glowing under the moonlight. And then, she vanished beneath the waves. The city never spoke of Miss Thelma again. Her house remained untouched, as if time had simply forgotten it. But the people remembered. They whispered of the storm, of the girl with the ocean in her eyes, of the voice that had spoken through the rain. They remembered the promise that had been broken. And they never broke it again. Far beneath the waves, Ida swam. She was home. And the ocean was finally at peace. For now. Because the sea never forgets. And neither did she.